The morning sun was just beginning to peek through the windows of Chicago O'Hare International Airport as passengers lined up at Gate B-17. Among them stood Agent Lee, a seasoned FBI operative who had mastered the art of blending in. To everyone around her, she was just another business traveler in a navy blazer and comfortable flats, checking her phone like the rest of the morning crowd. Flight 2847 to Seattle was running exactly on schedule. As the gate agent began the boarding announcements, Agent Lee adjusted her laptop bag and joined the orderly queue of Zone 2 passengers. She had specifically chosen a window seat in row 14. Not too close to the front to draw attention, but with a clear view of the middle section of the plane where most suspicious activities typically occurred. The familiar scent of coffee and hand sanitizer filled the air as passengers settled into their seats. Agent Lee went through her carefully practiced routine. Laptop stowed beneath the seat, noise-canceling headphones placed within easy reach, and a worn paperback novel that she'd never actually read placed on her lap. These small details were crucial. They helped create the persona of a frequent business traveler who had done this journey countless times before. But today was different. As she pretended to flip through her book, her trained eyes carefully observed each passenger boarding the plane. The flight attendants moved through their pre-flight checks with practiced efficiency, their blue uniforms crisp in the morning light. Then she noticed them. 2 air marshals boarding last, trying their best to look like ordinary passengers in their casual clothes. But to her experienced eye, their careful scanning of the cabin and the way they positioned themselves gave away their presence. Through the thin airplane windows, she could see the ground crew finishing their final checks. The early morning light cast long shadows across the tarmac, where luggage carts moved in a choreographed dance around the aircraft. Inside, passengers were settling into their seats, some already drifting off to sleep, others tapping away at their phones before the inevitable request to switch to airplane mode. Agent Lee noticed every detail while appearing to notice nothing at all. She saw how the flight attendant in the back galley checked her phone more frequently than usual. She noticed the businessman 3 rows ahead who seemed far too interested in the emergency exit procedures card. And most importantly, she spotted something during boarding that would later prove crucial to the entire operation. But for now, she simply sat, watched, and waited. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, welcoming everyone aboard and announcing their flight time to Seattle. As the plane pushed back from the gate, Agent Lee allowed herself a small smile. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned, though none of her fellow passengers had any idea that this routine morning flight was about to become anything but routine. The engines roared to life, and the plane began its taxi toward the runway. Agent Lee closed her eyes briefly, appearing to settle in for the flight like any other tired traveler. But beneath her calm exterior, her mind was sharp and alert, ready for whatever the next few hours might bring. As the plane lifted off the ground, leaving the Chicago skyline behind, she knew that this was just the beginning of what would become one of the most remarkable days in her career. The plane climbed steadily through the morning sky, banking gently as it turned westward toward Seattle. Somewhere in the cabin, a baby started crying, someone coughed, and the drink cart began its slow journey down the aisle. To everyone else, it was just another morning flight. But for Agent Lee, every minute brought them closer to the moment when everything would change. The flight had settled into that peaceful lull that usually comes after the first beverage service. Sunlight streamed through the small oval windows, creating patterns on the worn blue carpet of the aisle. Most passengers had fallen into their own routines, some watching movies on their screens, others typing away on laptops, and quite a few dozing with travel pillows wrapped around their necks. Agent Lee maintained her careful observation while appearing completely absorbed in her paperback novel. She'd been counting the number of times the flight attendant in the blue striped scarf had walked past her row, 7 times in the last 30 minutes, far more than necessary. Each time, the attendant's eyes would drift to a specific overhead compartment in row 23. The first sign that something was shifting came 3 hours into the flight. A subtle change in the cabin crew's behavior caught her attention. The senior flight attendant, a woman with graying hair tied back in a neat bun, was whispering into her crew phone more frequently than usual. Her expression remained professional, but Agent Lee noticed the slight furrow in her brow, the way her fingers drummed nervously against the galley wall. Then came the movement from the air marshals. The one seated in 18C had shifted position, casually stretching before moving to stand near the bathroom area. To the untrained eye, he looked like just another passenger waiting for the lavatory. But Agent Lee knew better. He was positioning himself closer to her row, trying to maintain a clear line of sight. What these trained professionals didn't realize was that Agent Lee had spotted something crucial during boarding. She had noticed a particular passenger, someone who didn't quite fit their carefully crafted story. This passenger had boarded in Zone 1, carrying a designer briefcase that seemed a bit too new, wearing clothes that were a bit too pressed for a supposed regular business traveler. More importantly, she had seen the almost imperceptible nod exchanged between this passenger and another in Zone 4. The plane hit a pocket of turbulence, causing the fasten seatbelt sign to illuminate with a gentle ding. Passengers who had been standing quickly returned to their seats. Agent Lee used this moment of movement to glance back, catching sight of the passenger from Zone 4 typing rapidly on their phone, despite the flight being well out of cellular range. In the galley, the flight attendants were huddled together, speaking in hushed tones. One of them kept glancing at her watch, then at row 23, then back at her watch. The tension in the air was building, though most passengers remained blissfully unaware, absorbed in their movies or sleeping peacefully. Agent Lee carefully pulled out her own phone, pretending to check the time. In reality, she was documenting every detail, every suspicious movement. She knew that what she had witnessed during boarding was about to unfold into something bigger. The flight attendant with the striped scarf passed by again, this time moving more quickly, her steps more purposeful. Through the window, the landscape below had changed from the patchwork farms of the Midwest to the rugged terrain of the mountain states. They were getting closer to Seattle, and Agent Lee could sense that time was becoming a critical factor. Whatever was going to happen needed to happen soon. The baby who had been quiet since takeoff started crying again, and somewhere in the back, a passenger laughed loudly at their movie. These normal, everyday sounds continued while beneath the surface, a complex operation was quietly unfolding. Agent Lee remained still, her posture relaxed, but her mind alert, knowing that her next actions would need to be perfectly timed. The captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing their initial descent into Seattle within the next hour. As passengers began adjusting their seats and gathering their belongings, Agent Lee noticed the air marshal near the bathroom make eye contact with his partner. She knew what was coming next, the moment when this routine flight would transform into something entirely unexpected. The change in cabin pressure was subtle as the plane began its gradual descent toward Seattle. Agent Lee had just finished her second cup of coffee when she noticed both air marshals moving with purpose. Their casual demeanor had shifted, not enough to alarm the average passenger, but enough for her trained eye to spot the difference. The time had come. The first air marshal, a broad-shouldered man in a navy polo shirt, made his way down the aisle with measured steps. His partner, wearing a gray sweater that couldn't quite hide his athletic build, positioned himself 2 rows behind. They moved with the practiced coordination of professionals who had done this many times before. "Ma'am," the first marshal said quietly, standing beside Agent Lee's row. His voice was low but firm, designed not to attract attention. "We need you to come with us, please." His hand rested casually against the seat in front, but his stance made it clear this wasn't a request. The other passengers had begun to notice. A young woman across the aisle quickly looked down at her magazine, pretending she hadn't been watching. An elderly gentleman 2 rows ahead turned around, curiosity evident on his weathered face. A teenager paused his movie, his earphones dangling forgotten around his neck. Agent Lee maintained perfect composure. She bookmarked her page with deliberate slowness, Gather her belongings with careful movements. Of course, she replied, her voice steady and clear. A flight attendant hovered nearby, her professional smile not quite masking her concern. As they moved toward the back of the plane, whispers followed them like ripples in a pond. A child pointed and asked his mother what was happening. Someone muttered about homeland security. The plane's engines hummed steadily beneath it all, a constant reminder that they were still miles above the earth. In the rear galley, away from prying eyes, the first marshal spoke again. "Ma'am, we've received a report about suspicious behavior during boarding and throughout the flight. We're placing you under temporary arrest until we can sort this out on the ground." His partner stood guard, effectively blocking the view from curious passengers. The flight attendant with the striped scarf appeared, holding a set of flex cuffs. Her hands trembled slightly. Clearly, this wasn't a regular part of her job. The overhead speakers crackled with another announcement about their approaching landing, the captain's voice somehow making everything feel more surreal. Through the small galley window, the clouds had thinned, revealing glimpses of the Cascade Mountains below. Agent Lee could see her reflection in the window, calm, collected, showing none of the anticipation she felt inside. She knew exactly how this would play out, but for now, she had to maintain her role. "I understand," she said simply, allowing them to secure her hands. The flex cuffs were loose enough to be comfortable, but tight enough to look convincing. The air marshal noted her cooperation with a slight nod, probably thinking this was going better than expected. The plane banked gently to the left, beginning its final approach into Seattle. Sunlight flashed across the windows, creating dramatic shadows in the cramped galley space. The flight attendant busied herself with securing the cabin, though her eyes kept darting back to the scene unfolding in her workspace. From her position, Agent Lee could see down the aisle into the main cabin. The passenger from Zone 1 was watching intently, trying to appear casual but failing to hide their interest. Another passenger in row 23 had gone completely still, their newspaper forgotten in their lap. Everything was falling into place exactly as planned. The captain announced their final descent into Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. As the plane descended through the clouds, Agent Lee caught fragments of radio chatter from the marshal's earpieces. Ground teams were already in position, though the marshals had no idea they weren't the only law enforcement personnel involved in today's events. The landing gear deployed with a heavy thunk that vibrated through the cabin. In the main cabin, passengers were straightening their seats, closing their tray tables, preparing for landing. None of them knew they had just witnessed the middle act of a much larger operation, one that would reach its climax very soon. The fluorescent lights in the airport security office buzzed quietly overhead, casting a harsh glow on the gray walls. Agent Lee sat calmly in a small interview room, still playing the role of a cooperative suspect. The room was typical. A metal table bolted to the floor, 4 chairs, and a one-way mirror that reflected her composed expression back at her. Outside, she could hear the muffled sounds of the airport. Announcements echoing through the terminals, the distant rumble of planes taking off. The air marshal who had arrested her stood near the door, his arms crossed, watching her with professional detachment. His partner had stepped out moments ago, presumably to contact their supervisors. The door opened, and a man in a pressed suit entered, carrying a manila folder. He had the confident stride of someone used to being in charge. "I'm Agent Thompson from Airport Security," he announced, taking a seat across from her. "We need to discuss the report we received about your activities on Flight 2847. This was the moment she had been waiting for. With measured movements, Agent Lee reached into her blazer's inner pocket. The air marshal tensed, but she slowly pulled out her FBI credentials, laying them on the table. The leather folder opened to reveal her badge and ID card, gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," she said, her voice carrying a quiet authority that hadn't been present before. "I'm Agent Lee, lead investigator on Operation Skywatch, and you've just helped us identify our target." The change in the room was instant and dramatic. Agent Thompson's expression shifted from stern authority to surprise, then understanding. The air marshal straightened up, his hand dropping from his weapon. Through the one-way mirror, she could hear movement, likely other officers reacting to this unexpected development. The passenger who reported me, Agent Lee continued, leaning forward slightly. They're part of a sophisticated smuggling ring we've been tracking for months. They spotted me during boarding, just as we predicted they would, and tried to neutralize the threat by reporting me first. She pulled out her phone, pulling up a series of photographs and documents. This operation spans 12 major airports across the country. The ring uses a complex system of spotters and couriers, all disguised as ordinary business travelers. They've managed to evade detection by blending perfectly into the regular flow of air traffic. The door opened again, and several more people entered, FBI agents this time, their expressions professional but pleased. Agent Lee's temporary role as a suspect was officially over. One of them handed her a tablet showing live surveillance footage of the terminal. On the screen, 2 plainclothes officers were discreetly following the passenger who had reported her. Right now, she explained, pointing to the tablet, that passenger thinks they've successfully diverted attention away from their operation. They believe I'm detained here, leaving them free to complete their drop-off. What they don't know is that we have teams in place throughout the airport. Agent Thompson was now fully engaged, his earlier suspicion replaced with professional interest. "How long have you been tracking them?" he asked, pulling his chair closer to review the documentation spread across the table. 6 months, Agent Lee replied, bringing up more files on her tablet. "We've mapped their entire network, from their recruitment methods to their delivery routes. But we needed one final piece, confirmation of their Seattle connection. When they reported me, they gave us exactly what we needed." Through the window, the afternoon sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the room. More officers were gathering outside the door, preparing for the operation's next phase. Agent Lee could feel the energy in the room shifting from tension to anticipation. "In about 20 minutes, she said, checking her watch, "they'll attempt to make contact with their local handler. When that happens," she paused, allowing herself a small smile. "Well, let's just say this isn't going to end the way they planned." The airport security office had transformed into a command center within minutes. Computers hummed, radio chatter filled the air, and officers moved with purpose. Agent Lee stood at a large wall-mounted screen, explaining the complexity of what they were dealing with to the assembled team. "Look at this footage from last month," she said, pointing to surveillance video playing on the screen. "Here's how they operate." The video showed ordinary-looking passengers moving through various airports, nothing suspicious at first glance. They hide in plain sight, using business-class tickets and frequent flyer accounts. They look exactly like what you'd expect, tired business travelers just trying to get home. Another agent rolled out a large map across the conference table. Red pins marked major airports across the country: Chicago, Dallas, Miami, Los Angeles. String connected the pins, creating a web of flight routes. Agent Lee traced a path with her finger, showing how the smuggling ring had been moving their goods. "They're brilliant in their way," she continued, pulling up more footage. "They never use the same route twice. They book real business meetings as cover stories. They even expense their flights to legitimate companies without the companies knowing they're being used as fronts." The room was silent except for the clicking of keyboards and the occasional crackle of a radio. Through the windows, they could see planes taking off and landing against the darkening sky. Agent Lee pulled up another screen, this one showing passenger manifests from the last 6 months. "We first noticed something was wrong when a routine audit flagged unusual travel patterns," she explained. "The same group of about 30 people, all with perfect business traveler profiles, all making slightly unusual flight choices. They'd take longer routes, pay more for specific flight times, always book certain seats." She clicked through to another screen, showing a complex diagram of connections. But here's what makes them special. They never carry anything illegal themselves. They're spotters and coordinators. They watch for security, choose safe routes, and manage the actual carriers, who are completely separate and usually don't even know who they're really working for. An officer raised his hand. But how did they get past security checks? Everything's so tight these days. Agent Lee nodded, anticipating the question. That's where it gets interesting, she said, pulling up more documentation. They created perfect cover stories. Every spotter has a real job, real business cards, real LinkedIn profiles. They actually do the jobs they claim to have. The smuggling is just a very profitable side business. The door opened, and another agent hurried in with fresh surveillance photos. Look at this, Agent Lee said, spreading them across the table. The passenger who reported me. They've made this exact trip 6 times in the last 3 months. Always on Tuesdays, always on morning flights, always in business class. To anyone checking, they look like a regular business commuter. She pulled up one more screen, this one showing financial records. They'd built an entire fake business travel ecosystem. They expense their flights to real companies, attend real meetings, and maintain real business relationships. It makes their unusual travel patterns almost impossible to spot unless you know exactly what to look for. The room had grown more crowded as additional officers arrived for the operation briefing. Agent Lee could see the understanding dawning on their faces as they realized the scale of what they were dealing with. This wasn't just another smuggling bust. This was something far more sophisticated. When they reported me on the flight, she continued, they thought they were being clever. A classic misdirection play. Point the finger at someone else to draw attention away from yourself. What they didn't realize was that we've been waiting for months for them to make exactly this kind of mistake. Through the windows, the sun had nearly set, casting a golden glow across the airport terminals. Agent Lee checked her watch again. Soon, the smuggling ring would make their move, thinking they had successfully neutralized a threat. They had no idea they had just walked into a trap 6 months in the making. The evening rush at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport was in full swing. Travelers hurried through the terminals, dragging their rolling suitcases across the polished floors. The smell of coffee and fast food drifted from nearby cafes. To any observer, it looked like a typical busy evening at the airport. But scattered throughout the crowd were dozens of undercover agents. Some posed as shop workers, others as janitors pushing cleaning carts. A few sat at gates pretending to wait for delayed flights. Each one was carefully positioned, creating an invisible net around the terminal. Agent Lee stood at a coffee shop, casually stirring her drink while watching the crowd through the reflection in the shop's window. Her temporary arrest had worked perfectly. The smuggling ring believed they had successfully diverted attention away from their operation. "Target is moving," crackled a voice in her nearly invisible earpiece. Heading towards Terminal B. Through the crowd, she could see their suspect walking confidently, pulling a designer carry-on bag. They had no idea they were being watched by over 20 trained agents. The suspect stopped at a newsstand, picking up a magazine. This was exactly what the FBI team had predicted. It was their usual signal to their contact that the coast was clear. Agent Lee took another sip of her coffee, watching as a second person entered the scene, browsing magazines at the same stand. "Second target confirmed," another voice whispered through the radio network. More agents were slowly closing in, maintaining their cover as ordinary travelers and airport staff. The tension in the air was electric, though invisible to regular passengers walking past. The first suspect picked up their bag and moved toward the airport's car rental desks. Their contact followed at a careful distance, exactly as the FBI had documented in previous operations. Agent Lee moved too, now pretending to check flight information on a nearby screen. What happened next was like a perfectly choreographed dance. As the suspects approached the meeting point, a quiet corner near the car rental offices, Agent Lee gave the signal. "All units, move in." execute with caution. The response was immediate but controlled. The janitor pushing his cart suddenly blocked one exit. Two travelers sitting nearby stood up, badges already in hand. A gift shop worker stepped out, cutting off another escape route. Within seconds, both suspects were surrounded by agents who seemed to materialize out of nowhere. The main suspect looked around in confusion, then understanding dawned on their face as they realized what was happening. Their contact made a brief attempt to walk away, but stopped when they saw more agents approaching from every direction. FBI, announced one of the agents, his voice firm, but quiet to avoid causing a scene. Please place your bags on the ground and keep your hands where we can see them. Other travelers barely noticed what was happening, the agents maintaining such professional calm that it hardly disrupted the normal flow of airport traffic. Agent Lee approached now, no longer playing any role. We've been watching your operation for months, she informed them quietly. We know about the other airports, the fake business meetings, everything. The look of shock on their faces confirmed what she already knew. They had never suspected the depth of the investigation. As the suspects were quietly escorted to a more private area, Agent Lee's team was already moving to Phase 2. Based on information they'd gathered, 3 more members of the ring were due to arrive on different flights within the next hour. Teams were in position at every gate, ready to intercept them as well. In the airport's security office, computers were tracking all incoming flights. Agents were coordinating with other airports across the country, where similar operations were now being launched. What had started as a single arrest on a morning flight from Chicago was rapidly expanding into one of the largest coordinated busts in recent history. The regular evening crowd continued to flow through the terminal, most of them completely unaware of the major operation unfolding around them. Parents still hurried children toward gates, business travelers still checked their phones, and airport staffs still announced departures and arrivals. But beneath this normal surface, a sophisticated criminal network was being systematically dismantled, one carefully planned arrest at a time. 2 days after the arrests at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, the full scope of the operation became clear. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of the FBI field office as Agent Lee stood before a room full of law enforcement officials, presenting the results of their 6-month investigation. The wall behind her was covered with photos, documents, and maps, all connected by red strings showing the complex web they had uncovered. On the central screen, images cycled through showing various airports, suspects, and evidence collected during the coordinated raids. What started as a single suspicious travel pattern, Agent Lee explained, led to the largest airport smuggling bust in recent history. She clicked through to a map showing all 12 airports involved in the operation. In total, we arrested 27 members of the ring across the country. The operation was synchronized down to the minute. As we made our moves in Seattle, teams in Chicago, Dallas, and other cities were doing the same. The evidence tables in the room were covered with seized items. Dozens of burner phones, laptops containing encrypted communications, and stacks of falsified business documents. Each piece told part of the story of how the ring had operated undetected for so long. Their business model was brilliant in its simplicity, she continued, pulling up financial records on the screen. They created a perfect cover using legitimate business travel. Every suspect we arrested had a real job, real business meetings, and real reasons to fly frequently. The smuggling operation was hidden within normal business travel patterns. An agent from Chicago raised his hand. How did they manage to keep it hidden for so long? Agent Lee picked up one of the seized laptops. They never got greedy. They moved small amounts, used different routes every time, and maintained their cover stories perfectly. If we hadn't noticed a pattern in their flight bookings, they might still be operating today. The room was packed with officers from various agencies, FBI, DEA, Customs, and airport security from multiple cities. Many were taking notes, studying the methods used to finally crack this case. Through the windows, Planes could be seen taking off and landing at the nearby airport, a reminder of how vital this security work was. The passenger who reported me on that Chicago flight, Agent Lee continued, bringing up surveillance footage from the plane. They were one of their most experienced spotters. When they saw me documenting suspicious behavior, they tried to neutralize the threat by reporting me first. It was a clever move, except it was exactly what we were waiting for. She clicked through to another screen showing the aftermath of the operation. Within hours of the first arrests, we had teams executing search warrants at storage facilities, homes, and offices across the country. The evidence we uncovered revealed operations dating back at least 3 years. The success of the operation had implications beyond just these arrests. Agent Lee pulled up new airport security protocols that were being implemented based on what they'd learned. This case has helped us identify weak points in current screening procedures. We're already working with airports to implement new security measures. A sense of accomplishment filled the room as she showed the final statistics. Over 24 arrests, millions in seized assets, and most importantly, the complete dismantling of a sophisticated criminal network. But there was something more important than just the numbers. What makes this case special, Agent Lee concluded, isn't just the size of the bust. It's what it teaches us about modern criminal operations. They're not just hiding in the shadows anymore. They're hiding in plain sight, using our normal daily routines as cover. It takes patience, observation, and teamwork to spot these patterns. As the briefing ended and agents began to file out, many stopped to shake hands and exchange cards. The operation had created new connections between law enforcement agencies, strengthening the networks that helped keep air travel safe. Outside, the airport continued its endless cycle of arrivals and departures. Thousands of travelers passed through its terminals, most never knowing how close they had come to a major criminal operation, or about the dedicated teams of professionals working behind the scenes to keep them safe.